So last year, I don't know if everyone was here when we did last year, but we did a quick survey of the reasons that the rationales for electricity being prohibited on Shabbat. Though we really focused on the modern approaches, like the last, like 21st century approaches that really emerged from some of the problems with the original analysis of the sources. So now we're going to go backwards, and we'll probably have to review the modern ones, but go to some of the earlier sources. So the halachic discussions about electricity divide into multiple sections, but there's the most the way it's often presented is there's the most stringent case, which is the case of the incandescent light bulb, right? That was like the one where all the poskim pretty much, though we'll see not everybody coalesced behind a single position, that it was biblically prohibited to have an incandescent light bulb on Shabbat, not necessarily on Yom Tov, for reasons that we'll see. And for these purposes, incandescent light bulb becomes a stand-in for anything that has a heating element, right? So that eventually will become electric heaters, is the same idea. Like those space heaters that you have or don't have, or I don't know what the restrictions are in your apartments, but in Gersh we weren't allowed to have it because it burned down a dorm. So got it. But those things, right? Same idea. Rav Shlomo Zalman was really the person who wrote most expansively about it, but he wrote a whole book on it called Minorat Ma'orei Eish, just on this topic. So that's one discussion. The second discussion are cases in which you don't have a burning hot filament, in which case you have to approach the sugya a little bit differently. So we're going to at least see the outline of these two issues. So let's start with the question of incandescent light bulbs. Okay, so we're going to do a survey. If you want a bit of a more in-depth treatment, you can borrow this book from me at some point. This is a very helpful book to have, the kashrut-kosher Beit Hashem. It was written by Rabbi Yisrael Rosen, who was the founder of the Somet Institute. If you know Somet, right? I think, did you go there? We probably went there at some point. It's the organization in Alon Shvut that is devoted to making technological devices that make it easier to use electricity on Shabbat. No. Okay. So anyway, so we took the guy. It's a worthwhile thing to do at some point. So he really, I mean, maybe not right now. I don't know if they're doing tours with whatever, but eventually. But they collected a lot of his articles over the years into this one volume, Beit Hashem. So it really lays out the relevant halachic issues quite clearly. So So let me quickly summarize the issue in terms of incandescent light bulbs. So that really goes like this, and that will get us to where we need to go with electricity. So the category, I thought it was on this sheet, but apparently not. This is what happens when I can't make my own. But I'll summarize it outside. It's really not that complicated. Basically, the Gemara in Shabbat Daf Mem Bet introduces a category called Gachelet Shel Matechet. Right? The Gemara says, Omar Shmuel, Mechabin Gachelet Shel Matechet B'Reshut HaRabim, B'Shvil Shelo Yizoku Bo Rabim. Avalo Gachelet Shel Eitz. So the Gemara says that if you are walking in the public sphere and you find a glowing ember, not an ember, red hot piece of metal, Gachelet Shel Matechet, a coal made of metal essentially, so then you're allowed to put it out so that it won't cause damage to the public, but not if you find a burning piece of wood. And the reason for this, so Rashi explains, is that when it comes to kibui, when it comes to extinguishing a fire, so even though gachelet shel matechet, this burning hot piece of metal, might be considered fire, mid-deoraita, in order for something to be considered kibui, in order to be considered extinguishing, it has to be the type of extinguishing that will create pecham, will create charcoal. Because otherwise, extinguishing is not a constructive act. Right? And there's a rule on Shabbat that nothing is asur mid-deoraita unless it is a malacha which is constructive rather than mekalkel. Right? If it's a destructive act, then it is at best rabbinically prohibited and not biblically prohibited. And therefore, extinguishing, which is almost definitionally a destructive act, we say is only prohibited on Shabbat if you do it in a constructive way, i.e., you do it in such a way that it, even though, yes, it's putting out the fire, it's also setting the groundwork for a better fire. So you probably know that next week, a week from today, when we light the Hanukkah candles, you know that sometimes the wick doesn't catch right at the beginning, right? It's just hard. So if you want it to catch better, right, I'm sure you've had this, right? It's hard to catch, but if you light the candle, it blows out, and you want to relight it, even though you're not obligated to. But you want to, the second time it catches much easier, right? Because once the wick is singed, right, it's much more flammable. It catches fire much more easily, right? So the Gemara says that the reason that mechabe is considered constructive is because when you blow out a fire, you create charcoal. You create something which is itself productive. Therefore, Rashi says that if you extinguish a piece of metal which is glowing hot, even if that's considered fire, so it won't be mechabe, because even if it's fire, when you extinguish it, it's not the type of extinguishing that will create a constructive object. It won't create pecham. It won't create charcoal, a usable material. Now, what that already implies, though it doesn't state explicitly, is what? Is that this is a unique halacha in the extinguishing of red-hot metal. But in terms of igniting it, it sounds like it is potentially fire, right? Because it sounds like it's a unique halacha in extinguishing. Yeah.
What would it mean to ignite fire? Because it's really not like actually burn.
Good, right? So this is the question. So the question is, well, is that true, right? Is this fire? Because what would that tell us about fire, right? I mean, what would it tell us about halachic fire if...
Like, is fire just like a threshold over a certain temperature?
Right, so that's what we got to figure out, right? So that's what we got to figure out. So the Gemara doesn't address this directly, right? Besides for the implication that we have here. But the implication of Rashi, right, again, the implication of Rashi is that it is fire, because it's a technicality that you don't violate mechabe, right? Namely that it's not the type of extinguishing of fire that creates charcoal, which implies that it's fire. So that's the implication. So, but is that actually the case? So, this is a little bit less clear. So Shulchan Aruch tells us in Shin Lamed Daled Chav Zayin that gachelet hamunachat memakom sherabim nizokim ba. When you find this coal that is in a place where people might get hurt, yachol lechabota, you're allowed to extinguish it. Bein im shel matechet, bein im shel eis, whether it's metal or it's wood. V'Rambam oser b'shel eis. And this comes down to whether or not we accept the maskana of the Gemara in Shabbat, and whether we think that Gemara is dependent on machloket of Yehuda or Shimon, in what way. Now, the Magen Avraham there writes in 6 words, why is it that you're allowed to extinguish, according to everybody, a red-hot piece of metal? So the Magen Avraham says like Rusi, because what we learn from here is that a red hot metal is just not fire. Right? He just says, it's not extinguishing because it was never lit. Right? That's how he reads it. There is no fire. Right? Fire is fire, not something which is as hot as fire. It's just not fire. Right? Fire isn't just something that gives off light and heat. It has to be something which has a substance which is consumed, which is which has fuel. And that's the way the Magen Avraham seems to take it. The Magen Avraham actually seems to think that even an incandescent light bulb or a burning filament is not going to be halachic fire. Now, but this is not at all a majority position. Okay? This position was adopted by Rav Goren. Right? Rav Goren Halacha was one of the few people who, even once there were incandescent light bulbs and heating elements, actually weighed in and said, yeah, we follow this read of the Magen Avraham. And in fact, unless you have fire, so no type of burning filament, no type of heated filament is ever going to be considered fire. And this is what Rav Goren writes. He wrote, Natati el libi lachkor be'inyan zeh. I put my mind to understanding this. Ula'achar chakira u'dirisha yisodit. And after a in-depth and fundamental analysis, hitchaver etzleinu lelo kol sel shel safek psak halacha brura al hadlakat hachashmal b'Shabbat. We came to the following conclusion about electricity on Shabbat. Shebarzel miluban eino nidon ke'esh klal mishum she'eno bo'er mamash. That a filament, an electric filament, an electric current which heats up a filament still will not be fire because it doesn't burn. Based on the Magen Avraham, but Beirish Magen Avraham al barur shekamenatom mashkadav she'eno nisraf she'eno chalav and abach later because it's not consumed. Fire for Rav Goren needed to be consumed, right? Needed it to be the type of thing that would consume the fuel, the object that was burning. V'davar pashut azam ha'od shein shum makom la'achmir b'chutz zeh shebetoch ha'chashmal mimatechet ha'mitchamein al yidei eish mamash. And therefore, there's no reason to be worried about these burning filaments, these heated filaments as fire. מתברר היטב שאין כלל חיוב דאורייתא על הדלקת מנורת החשמל בשבת. And therefore, it's 100% clear there is no biblical violation of turning on even an incandescent light bulb. It's just not fire, and that's all there is to it. And the Marsham before him wrote something along these lines as well in Shuvah Reish Tet Vav. And he says, "V'lo ached ki ani chochech v'libi im ki behavara v'chiboy shel ha'electric electric." There's too many letters in this word. He spells electric. This is like when you read the European Shuvah. It's impossible. Hey, ayin, lamed, ayin, kuf, tet, reish, yud, sadi, yud, tet, tet. Yeah, I don't know. Electric.
Because you're getting electric.
Yeah, exactly. Yesh bo melachat d'oraita. Kevan zelo yakam b'mishkan. He said it's not the oraita is not in the Mishkan. Yesh lo medulek mishum avara v'chibud v'chavingam shereino ish mamash ve'eno sorei avarzel. Keish didan she'ochel ve'ena shota. Now, I'll just say this outside quickly because it's sort of funny, but there were those who responded to him and said, no, you're wrong. I'll prove to you that fire doesn't need to consume to be defined as fire because we know of at least one fire which was not consumed, the burning bush. But the Marsham actually flipped it on his head and said, no. Fire needs to consume. That's why Moshe was shocked, right? Because he said the fire isn't consuming, which means it's not doing what fire normally does, right? Which means that you cannot prove anything from that story. Shocking, really. That is not where we learn all halacha of electricity on Shabbat. Really, quite shocking. Yes, very shocking. Yes. That would be the very anticlimactic part of like all the Exodus movies. You know, Moshe sees the burning bush moving, and then you have a sidebar of halacha debating of whether that proves that electricity is
Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but
of the Ten Commandments. Yes, exactly.
so like the story of Moshe.
Okay, so this is your challenge is for Purim. You know, this is your Yudim Bayim sidebar, halachic sidebar of the burning bush. Yes. Okay. Enjoy. That's this is very, very, very narrow audience humor here. You know, it's very niche. Yes. So they might be part of the same niche who find it funny. You know. Look, I'm sure they will. Yes. You know, they're whatever. Look, niche jokes are not bad as long as you're talking within the niche. You know. They can't hear you. Don't worry. They can hear me. They can't hear you. Right? This is the complaint I get sometimes. But mostly from the guys in my share, because if they miss share and then they're listening, it's very weird because they'll hear me, but if anyone's participating, right? Because like I'm sitting behind this thing. What? No, they can't hear you. There's no way they can hear you, right? They might then ask me, who can I not hear and what were they saying, but they can't hear you. Okay, I won't divulge anything. But that is the minority position. The majority position was that whatever you think about electricity in general, incandescent light bulbs or any other burning filament, any other heated filament, is in fact going to be asur midoraisa. And this is based on a basic consensus in the Rishonim, where the Rambam says in Parak Yud Bet Halacha Aleph of Hilchot Shabbat, "Hamechamei min habarzel kidei l'tzarfo b'mayim harei ze toldat mav'ir v'chayav." If you heat up metal in order to l'tzarfo b'mayim is you put it into water to harden it, right? So you soften it with heat. What? Is that what is it quenching when you're the metal? I think there's a better word for it, but it escapes me. It escapes me. I think there's a more technical term. So it is mav'ir. From here you see that mav'ir, right, burning, lighting a fire does not require the burning of fuel, right? It just doesn't. Now, Rav Goren is aware of this Rambam, and Rav Goren says, no, the Rambam is talking in a very specific case. Only when that's actually what you're doing, where you're heating up the metal in order to then, right, reform it and cool it in the water and harden it, so then it's d'oraisa. But otherwise, heating a filament by itself is not asur. The Rambam in other places implies that it's not mavir, but it's mevashel. It's considered cooking. The Ravid seems to side with the latter formulation, that it's cooking. But whether you think a heated filament is cooking or fire, the majority view, as reflected by Rosh Zalman Auerbach in Minchat Shlomo Chelik Bet Siman Yutet, is that at least when there is a heated filament, which again, there aren't so many incandescent light bulbs floating around these days, but the same thing would be true of your space heaters and the like. So then it is definitely going to be d'oraisa, either because of mavir, because of fire, or mivashel. I will point out that this works. That there is, besides for the chumrah part of this, there's other implications. So, for example, Havdalah, there's an argument to be made that if you have an incandescent light bulb, you can make the bracha on the incandescent light bulb, which you can't on LED or fluorescent or halogen. I'm not sure actually about halogen, I think. I don't know if you've ever seen the Machon Somet travel Shabbat candle lights. They basically created 2 electric candles for when people are traveling, because according to most poskim, you can fulfill the obligation of Shabbos candles with electric lights, because it really is about light. Some people want it to be with incandescent light bulbs, because then it's plausibly not just light, but fire. The problem, as I said, is that most lights these days are not incandescent, right? Because, they're wasteful and they're phasing them out. They're hard. Here it's very hard. Here most of them are not. There are other things.
They're mostly decorative.
Right. So that's basically what these are. Yeah, like the Somet Shabbos candle lights are two little decorative candles with little incandescent light bulbs on the top, right? Well, actually, Hanukkah time, this is important. Since Hanukkah is next week, I'll just mention this, that based on this, there were poskim who felt that you could fulfill your obligation of Hanukkah candles with electric lights. Now, they thought that you couldn't necessarily do with all electric lights. So they thought you might be able to do with electric lights. For Shlomo Zalman is this very interesting position that in order for it to be considered a Shabbat, a Hanukkah candle, it needs to not just be fire, it needs to be a candle. So what distinguishes a fire and a candle for Shlomo Zalman is basically whether it has a finite fuel source or not. And therefore, Shlomo Zalman felt that you couldn't have a plug-in menorah as your menorah because since it's plugged into the wall, it has essentially an unlimited source of fuel. So he said, if you wanted to use an electric light, what you would have to do is use a battery-powered one, because then the fuel source is all contained within the menorah. And therefore, ad hayom, some people will tell you, that if you're flying on an airplane on Hanukkah, so your last choice of lighting the Hanukkah, if you can't leave after nightfall or have a shliach light for you in your home or all the other mechanisms that are probably better, if you're really, really stuck lighting on the plane, so you can rely on this position of Rosh Shlomo Zalman without a bracha, because Rosh Shlomo Zalman only said this, he wasn't sure about it, but he thought that it was true, and will tell you to get a battery-powered, you can really just use a flashlight, right? Because a flashlight, you only need one candle, right? That's the minimum. And I know people have done this. You just sort of stand up a flashlight on the plane and yeah, exactly. And you turn it off, right? Yeah, my friend Rabbi Elad Mazer said he did this once when he was traveling. His posting in general is Reb Nebenzahl, I think. Definitely a lot of the time, if not in general. And Reb Nebenzahl is a student of Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and told him, yeah, if you have no choice, then this is what you should do. And he did the flashlight trick. And that again emerges from this position. It's a little bit more complicated because there are some people who are saying maybe it is fire, but it's not fire, which is similar to the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, and maybe for Hanukkah you need something that looks like that in the Beit HaMikdash. There's a whole bunch of other reasons that you might not like it, but at any rate, Rosh Shlomo Zalman, following the position we're going to see in a moment, felt that this was a plausible halachic position on Shabbat, that it's fire, and therefore for all the carryovers, for Hadlakat Nerot, on Shabbat, Havdalah, for Hanukkah, etc. So this is Rosh Shlomo Zalman's position. Hinei barur, orach hashmala ke'ela she'itchilu lefakfek im nikra eish olav. There are those people who doubted or started to doubt whether a incandescent light bulb is fire. Ulam hadavar hu pashut ubarur shu eish kamor. But it is obvious and clear that it is fire. Ba'achut hadak shebetoch hamenorah, the filament shemalbin vilohet, that gives light, it heats up, or right, it burns, it heats up, it gives light. Dino kigachelet shel matechet. It is like a metal coal. V'aval bishu sagur b'toch zchuchit she'norak mimena yisod hachumtza v'shum dar ein achud kala v'nisrav. And even though it's in a bulb which prevents it from burning out, right? It limits the amount of oxygen. We can't be mechadesh, right? We can't introduce the thesis that fire is only that which consumes. The creation of fire or its increase in intensity is mavir, and that's what the Rambam says. Kidei litzaref let's start from the old mav'ir. Yeah, now he notes that if you did hold that fire needed to be consumed, so you can't really say, oh, well, eventually the light bulb will burn out, because in halacha in general, we rely on that which is sensed, and you don't really sense that it's burning out, and therefore, if you're going to assume that a light bulb is eish, it must be because you think that eish does not need to consume the fuel. And then he notes, and even though scientists obviously know there's a difference between what we call fire and what we call a burning hot piece of metal, halachically they are the same. And his proof is that there's also chemical differences between a fire that's burned with oil or paraffin or, whatever, any other fuel source. They're all different. Alcohol fires, right? They're all different, and yet they're all fire, halachically, right? Scientifically, they're different. For mivashel, there might be some differences. And then he goes farther, and he says that the people who think that an incandescent light bulb is derabanan should presumably think that an electric oven is also derabanan for bishul, right? Because once you say it's not fire, so it's not fire, and he said, right, that's already, right, he just can't accept any of these chidushim. Well, no, because if you cooked it in the sun, it would be mutter. Well, yeah, right, cooked in the sun, it would be mutter, right? If you cooked it with something that was heated by the sun, it would be derabanan because it looks like it was heated by fire. Right, so it's clear that it's not just the result, because we care about the source. Right, if you put it out in the middle of the Sahara Desert, even if it cooks, it's mutter l'chatchila. Right, and if you use a magnifying glass and make it told of chametz, then presumably it's also going to be d'Rabbanan. So therefore he concludes, and therefore it's just absurd to say that a filament is not fire, and this is, in fact, the majority position, and at least when it comes to heated filaments, we rule like the Rambam, and we assume that it is fire. Okay? That's the background in incandescent light bulbs. But, as I said, this line of argumentation helps you for incandescent light bulbs, it helps you for space heaters, it helps you for electric ovens and electric stovetops, it helps you for hair dryers, basically anything that has a heated filament. But it doesn't help you for anything that doesn't have a heated filament. So, laptop, phone, LED neon, LED lights, halogens. No, halogens do get hot. Whatever. What? It just helps us. It doesn't provide any halachic information, right? Meaning it concludes that the result of a burning hot metal filament is H. But it doesn't tell you that electricity per se is problematic. It says nothing about electricity. It says something about the result of a burning hot filament. But it tells us, fine, does nothing for us. It tells us nothing, okay? It tells us nothing about cell phones and laptops and LED lights and whatever. I don't know. Take your pick of all the different things that you have. Your clocks and your. Why am I blanking on what we use electricity for? But everything. Right? What? Fridge probably. Yeah, I don't think it doesn't have a heating element. It's cooling element. Okay. So what about electricity? Stuff, right? Meaning electricity per se, and not electricity that causes a filament to burn. Right? What is right? So we started talking about this last year, but now let's go back to the earlier sources. So we saw already last week that the perhaps one of the earliest positions was the position of the Beit Yitzchak. Remember, what did the Beit Yitzchak say? Molid, right? Molid, right? That's here in 11 in a longer form than I gave you, right? But it is the tshuva of the Beit Yitzchak, okay? So that is possibility one. But the most machmir position that emerged was the position of the Chazon Ish. Okay, and the Chazon Ish was the one who saw in electricity boneh, right? Either building or makeh v'patish, or the completing building act of a building. Now, where does he get this from? So, in order to understand this, we have to understand a little bit about the parameters of buildings. Here, look at the Gemara in Shabbat Mem Zayin. And I do thank, who is this? Shmuel Lesher, for having a easily findable source sheet. So when my computer didn't work, I could get this on paper, and he put the translation. So there you go, which was nice of him. So the Gemara says as follows: Levi bar Shmuel ashkachinhu la Rabbi Abba u Rav Huna bar Chia davu kaimei apitcha de Rav Huna. So Levi bar Shmuel found Rabbi Abba and Rav Huna bar Chia who were by Rav Huna's house. So Amar lehu malach dir mita shel tarsiyim b'Shabbat. He said, "Are you allowed to reassemble this weaver's loom? Right? It was a collapsible thing on Shabbat." Amar le shapir dami. Said yes. Also, Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rav Shmuel, Amar Mita shel tarsiyim b'Shabbat chayv chata. But didn't Rav and Shmuel say that if you reassemble this loom, then you violate Shabbat? And you're chayv chata, meaning it's a biblical violation. So the Gemara says, but wait a second. If you put a menorah, a candelabra back together on Shabbat, you're chayav chatat. It's biblically forbidden. With a plasterer's pole, which has different parts to it, if you put it back, it's rabbinically forbidden, but not biblically. Rabbi Simai Omer, Keren Agula Chayav, Keren Pshuta Patur. Rabbi Simai says if you do it with you have a rounded horn, right, which is a trumpet which can be taken apart and it's hard to put back together, you're Chayav. But a straight horn, which is easy to reassemble, so you are Patur. It's only Asher Midrabanan. So the Gemara, right, basically, right, begins the discussion. We know that there's a prohibition called boneh on Shabbat, of building, right, and a makeh v'patish. But the Gemara's question is, okay, what if you're not building something new, but you're reassembling? So then, what is the halacha? And obviously, you can already see why this is relevant for circuits, because you're not creating something from new, right? You're simply, right, reconnecting it. So there's good reason to believe that this would not be problematic. So the Gemara here is dealing with these things that are fundamentally built but have to be reassembled. So you have this bed, this loom thing, which they say can be reassembled, and then they said, but why? You have this other, right, the mitzasel tarsiyim, which is biblically forbidden from putting together. A candelabra, reassembling it is forbidden on Shabbat. This plasterer's pole, which is somewhat easier to put together on Shabbat, rabbinically you shouldn't, but if you do, it's not biblically problematic. A horn, a trumpet, it depends. If it's circular and therefore complicated to build, once it's disassembled, putting it back together is considered rebuilding it. Whereas if it's simple, so then it's not.
IKEA furniture versus a collapsible furniture.
Yeah, something like that. Exactly. Right, that an IKEA furniture, even though it's meant to be assembled easily, is still clearly, right, boneh makeh v'patish, whatever, well, we'll see what it is, but that's clearly building, right, whatever it is, whereas opposed to, or a folding chair, right? A folding chair is not, right? A folding chair before it was flat and now it's a chair, that's mutter, right? And I'm sure you have used folding chairs on Shabbat. Not in Israel. No one has folding chairs, right? They have these ridiculous, right? They have these, the stackable chairs.
No, I think people have
No, people do have them. People even bring them from America. It's like one of those things they put on their lips. I have folding chairs. Yeah. No, they do. There are folding chairs. The reason I think they're less popular in Israel is because there's less storage space in Israel. So like these, right, they all take up the room of one chair, because you can just stack them to the ceiling, as opposed to like folding chairs that...
Well, remember, it's like if you're just a family that's having like 5 houses.
Even 5 houses don't come with closets, right? If the building... Well, but but no matter how many you have of these, they take up the same amount of space in your house. You can just stack them, as opposed to folding chairs. The more you have, what? Yes, it is unimportant. I do agree. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says, "Inu damar ki haitana detanya about malbeinot amita kran amita chimshel sikvis lo yachzir v'nechzir patur." He said, "You're right. He holds that it is permitted, right? Meaning you have 3 positions. You have some things which are biblically prohibited and some which are rabbinically prohibited, but how could you ever say it's mutter?" So he said, well, there's a 3rd position who says that if you have this bed frame, right, which is basically collapsible, so you're even allowed to reassemble it. That if you reassemble it, it's patur. If you hammer it in, it's chayav. But if it's loose, not only is it not biblically prohibited, but it's mutter l'chadchila. Rabbi Chama have a mata gal lenita hadle biutaba amar leum rabban l'rava my daita min manasadu need the surah dal right aleka you do rabban miyaika. So it said that Rav Huna used to have a collapsible bed, and he would put it together on Yom Tov. And he said, how could you do that? How can you say that you can put it together? Maybe it's not biblically forbidden, but it is at least rabbinically forbidden. And he says, no, it's loose, and therefore it's mutter, even l'chadchila, right? So you have these 3 levels. Things which are building are biblically prohibited. Things that are like quasi-building might be rabbinically, and things that are loose, there's at least a position in the Gemara that they are, that it is permitted l'chadchila. Now, Rashi, if you look, Rashi says, right, in number 2, that the difference seems to be that yitka, when you do it with chozek strong, right, you make it permanent, then that is, again, either makah patur or bona d'oraita. That comes down to whether this is yesh binyan b'kelim. And the case of patur is when you have to take it apart and put it back together all the time. So this is the type of sugya here that is in the background. So let's skip for a moment now to the Chazon Ish, okay? Let's try to at least get the 2 main positions out there. So look at the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish came up with this argument that electricity closing the circuit is boneh maku patish, mostly boneh. And he says in 7, this is Chazon Ish and Siman Nun in Orachayim, Od yesh mishum tikun mana, you are fixing. When you close a circuit, you're fixing something. Ke'evan shema'amido al tchunato lizrom et zerem hachashmal b'tzmidut v'karov ha'davar ze boneh min haTorah ka'osek kli. Since you are building it, you're enabling it to work, you are making a new vessel. And there's a general machloket in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Ein binyan b'kelim. There is no building b'kelim, but there's a machloket rishonim, whether that means Ein binyan b'kelim, that means that building with kelim is not, or building a new kli is not. Everyone seems to agree that creating a new kli is usur, either because of boneh, and then you limit the parameters of Ein binyan b'kelim, or because of makir patish. The Chazon Ish here takes the argument that closing the circuit is boneh. Why? And he said, and he said, even if you don't like boneh b'kelim, this is boneh because it's attached to the house. By plugging it in, you attach it to the wall, and therefore it's boneh. ואין גם משום בניין וחילם, אלא דינו כמחובר, ויש בו משום בניין וסתירה, אבל הוכחה היא נפקותא בזה, אפילו וכן כעניין חשוב בונה. But at any rate, it is building. ובפתיחה לחשמל שמכניסים הזרם בחוטים, חשוב לעולם כתוקע. And when you open the electricity, it's like tokeh, it's like that jamming in, which we saw in the Gemara, right, where you have to jam something in, right, to make it a permanent kli, it's usher. Whether you call that bone or makav politics, the Chazon Ish doesn't care so much. The avim tivzol the kohen shel saydin afetaka inayel midrabanan, and even if in some of the cases that we saw in the Gemara, those are only the rabbanan. Hainu dafka b'harkava shel shtei gshamim she'efshar lechashvan kishnayim. Kishnayim mishtatfin b'vula achat. That's when you're taking two pieces together. They don't really become one. So maybe you could conceptualize it as their rabbanan. Kol shepikuran nachut l'tiach shalam namuch. Aval tikun tzara ligashem and alzay de shimush. But to put something together and make it usable, badai chashiv boneh. It is building. Even if it's only for some time, and then you take it apart, doesn't matter. Dafsika hi mikano lehaba. Vatsura rishona ino baterud min hageshem v'acharei shadlaka u'binyan hakibuy u'soter. So the Chazon Ish comes up with this position that this is not like that Gemara. Right? That Gemara tells you that when you jam things into this d'oraita, and even though some of those things are viewed as not d'oraita, that doesn't matter. Because those are only maybe when you take two separate things that easily come apart, so that's not d'oraita. But once you turn on an electric circuit, you have created an integrated whole, and now it's useful, and that is boneh, tikkun mana, makav patish, and that's why it's usher. Elsewhere, the Chazon Ish has a formulation that because it used to be essentially dead, and now it's alive, right? You've given it life. Mevi min hamavet el achayim. If you bring something from death to life, it is boneh. Right? That is a different type of boneh, which leads to these fascinating discussions. The same that we saw by Molid, right? There's some people talk about making seltzer being d'oraita. There's some who say making seltzer is boneh because you're giving the water life, right? It used to be flat and now it's bubbly. I see the look in your face. That is not even close to the reaction I had the first time I read that tshuva, where I think I yelled at the top of my lungs in the middle of the Beit Midrash. I was so horrified. Well, neither is electricity, but he's saying you give it chiyut, give it a life force.
Okay, my phone died. Now I have to you're actually you answer more questions. Like water, my phone doesn't
I don't know.
Cancer. My phone doesn't have old age. And so
But your phone does die, yes, we know.
Like that is just
I know, it's figure of speech that anthropomorphizes your phone, which is, a problem. Now, but Rosh Zalman wrote a series of letters to the Chazon Ish where he pushed back on this. So look in 8 and 9, right? So look at, this is Chelek Aleph Siman Tet, and Chelek Aleph Shiva Yud Aleph. It's also Yud Bet. So Rosh Zalman pushed back, and he said, first he was asked about a microphone, right? And a telephone he says, "V'davar shemush b'mikrofon, telephone v'ramkol b'mod achol l'tzorach tefila v'knesset v'nigdam l'inyan Shabbat v'yom tov v'darech eret shaon b'Shabbat v'yom tov." He wanted to know about microphone on Shabbat and in chol for davening and a wind-up watch. So he says, "Yadua shegam l'inyan shaon tov v'ashilet yavet." The Yavitch felt that there's no problem in resetting a wind-up watch. Because since the watch is made to be rewound, it's no different than opening and closing a door. Right? It's not creating something new, you're just using that which is. And he says, But I saw the Chazon Ish who said the halacha is Yerich lo yotzer chadash u'der yitzchok al panim she'enu kulam. Lo tzchonai sheboneh makeh patish. The Chazon Ish, following his own argument, said, rewinding a watch is boneh or makeh patish because you're bringing it back to life. You're starting it again. He said, according to that, then I would have a shaila even on children's toys with a spring, right? And then maybe you could say that it's at least dirabanan because it's creating something new. But if you look at 9, he writes a letter to the Chazon Ish. Okay, and he writes, the Sefer Chazon Ish, I saw what you wrote in the Chazon Ish. He said, what you said is novel. What are you talking about? This is the call. He said, with all due respect, people have been talking about electricity for 100 years, and no one ever said it's building. Oh, you say Shamati Omrim Bishmol Shomaran Bal Chazon Ish, Shigam Bishash, Ein Shum Zer Machutim Ukshad Dam, Lochit Al Kapdol Nasa Daim Shum Davar, Mikom Mokom Etzim Skir Magal Yota Aruch Midugan Lazakash Yadai Deachakach and Deshaon, Av Gam Zeh Chashuv Boneh. And I heard the Chazon Ish went farther. Even setting the clock in advance is Boneh, even though you're not doing anything now. He said, this is what I heard from the Chazon Ish. But he said, first of all, that's definitely wrong, right? Setting the timer is at best grumma. That's what his argument is.
Wait, is he talking about like winding a watch?
In the first one, he's talking about winding a watch, yeah.
You said that would be the same?
Shlomo Zalman thinks it's not boneh. He thinks it might be asur midirabanan.
Okay.
But then he said, but what about this Chazon Ish's position that it's building? So he says, look down the next paragraph. He says, "L'chora nira lefiza. Hu adinami machnes borek toch she'ono otomatic. Did you yichabel achar zman? They'll just take a binyan." Or according to Chazon Ish, you would say setting a timer, so maybe it's boneh. V'alagav she's over to etem and giving kashrut-kosher. Mikom achar rakli. L'man yichabel achagas chashmal me'elav shever kashrut boneh. By setting the timer in motion, be boneh. Ela shenireh lefi da'ati tzarich iyun. Ken shel shivu pula kazish rayun zadir bekala sota. He said, but wait a second. When you deal with an electric appliance, you're not creating something new. You're using something that's used all the time. How does this fit into the Gemara, right? How does this fit? The Gemara said, I create something new. It's boneh. If it's tight, it's doraita. If it's loose already, it's derabanan. Or mutter lechatchila. Here, this seems to be even less than the Gemara's case of derabanan. The Chazon Ish says this is super doraita, right? Because you're creating something new. You're bringing it to life. Shlomo Zalman looks back and he said, what are you talking about? The Gemara is talking about creating a new object. Tightly doraita, weekly, asur derabanan, mutter lechatchila. But an electric circuit, it totally existed the entire time. You're just using it. That's not boneh. He said, "Lo dami lo zechalon balayla v'vinyan shel bayit la shemesh ta'ir sham bayom the shaber chashuv boneh gam balayla." He said, if I put in a window at night, sure, that's building, even though it doesn't have effect until the day. I get that. So sure, making a window, you build something. Oh, it's building. Great. Set a timer, first of all, is external. And he says, besides, but he said this is no different than turning on a faucet. Right? If everything is working, you just open the faucet, the water comes out. That's what you're doing. Etc. So therefore he says, he said maybe the Chazon Ish, who says that even a timer is building, maybe that's if you set a timer forever, right? Like you set a timer now and forever. So maybe that's bonus. But otherwise it's grumma. So he says, I've heard that the Chazon Ish says that not only is it boneh when you do it directly, but it's boneh through a timer. He says, I don't buy either of them. Through the timer, that makes no sense because it's, first of all, it's only grama, it's indirect. And second of all, you're just, in the end of the day, and this is where Shlomo Zalman has many, many arguments with Chazon Ish, but this is the argument he brings up over and over again, which is, look at the sugya we've been talking about. Right, the Chazon Ish looks at this, right, we have this sugya that tells us that when it comes to a kli, even if it is easily assembled, so if it's taken apart completely and you have to reassemble it tightly, so yes, it's d'oraita. If it goes back together easily, it's derabanan. And if it goes back together loosely, it's mutar lechatchila. But the Chazon Ish comes around and says, but if something was totally unusable before, so when I close the circuit and thereby I do two things. I close the circuit, I make it usable, I bring it to life, right? All these create a sort of constellation of values that we call boneh or makav patish, some sort of building. And he's so convinced of this, and he goes farther. He says, even if I set a timer in advance, right, it's boneh. Because now I've built it in. And Rosh Shlomo Zalman looks at him and he says, I don't get either argument. He said, first of all, a timer, even if you think that an electric circuit is usher because it's boneh, setting a timer is at best derabanan because it's grama, it's indirect. Right? This is not like building a window at night when it's not effective because there's no light. Because there you actually built something. Unless you're setting a timer forever, so maybe you could say you did something permanent, you changed the essence. That's not boneh. But then more systematically, he says, I don't know what you're talking about, this is boneh. Right? Boneh is you create something new. Right? You create something new. You don't take something that's usable and use it. He said closing a circuit is like turning off on and off a faucet or like opening and closing a door. Right? No one ever said that closing a door is boneh. Right? Because before there was a hole in the wall, now there's no hole in the wall. Right? Even if you lock the door, why? Because that's how it's used. Right? That's how it's used. It's derech hashmisho. It wasn't broken before, and it's not fixed now. It's not created now. It's just being used. And everything in the sugya was when it was disassembled before. When it's disassembled and you reassemble it. So then, if you reassemble it strongly, it might be d'oraita, weakly, derabanan, etc. But that's not what's going on. An electric appliance, when it's not plugged in or it's not turned on, it's not broken. It's like water, right? I turn on the faucet, the water comes out. So here I close it, the electric comes in, and now it's usable. But that's not boneh. It was a vacuum before, it is a vacuum now. The circuit wasn't broken, the circuit was open. And now you're closing it. Right? That doesn't fit the model. So here you have two diametrically opposed positions. You have the Chazon Ish who views electricity as the most machmer and rejects any comparison to these sugyos of reassembling that are derabanan or maybe it's loose or whatever. It's just usher because you're creating something new. And the Rosh Shlomo Zalman goes the opposite extreme. He says, what are you talking about? And if you look here at number 6, as it's summarized in the Sefer Lamed and Malachot, he says, here's the rule of many poskim, of many Rishonim. Anything that's used in the normal way of using it, that's not melacha. Klomar, meaning to say, anything that's used in the way that it's used, in the way that object is normally used, it can't be d'oraita. But and what's the reason? Because usage cannot be considered the finishing of a process. Usage is exactly what it sounds like. It's usage. This is true for bona and makav patish. But he says it's true in other malachot as well. And this is the the main set of arguments that Rav Shlomo Zalman levied against the Chazon Ish. Now, the truth is he went through many, many others, right? Many, many others. Now, to be fair, that these types of arguments don't just work against the Chazon Ish, but at some level they also work against who? The Beis Yitzchak we saw last week, right? Because what's true on the biblical level might also be true for the rabbinic prohibition of molid, where molid as well, even though we saw the parameters are very complicated, it's very clear that whatever molid is creating something new. And once you have this yesod that anything which is derech tashmisha, which is done in the way that's normally used, that's not considered creating, so that might be a way of negating the derabanan as well of molid. So, okay, I think right, so to summarize what we've seen, now we've seen, right, two positions, right? We've seen the base, the first thing we saw today was cases where there's a heated filament. And there we saw that the majority view, following the Rambam, is that it's mavir, mibim mavashel. Though we noted that based on Magen Avram, Rav Goren was makil and felt that even turning on an incandescent light bulb or anything else with a heated filament is not fire d'oraita. Then we moved to electricity in general. And there we saw, last week we already seen the position of Rav Yitzchak Shmelkes that it's derabanan because it's molid. We saw all the problems with that last week, right? Which is, you're not really creating something new, you're using that which exists. The whole category of molid is subject to machloket. No one really knows what it means, right? Etc. What? Yes, which is the most problematic of them, right? It's a very problematic sheet. Now then we move to what has become one of the most famous machmir positions, if not the most, which is the Chazon Ish says, boneh makav patish, because you create something new and you bring it to life. And he's so convinced of this that he says it's true even if he said it on a timer. Shlomo Zalman pushes back and says, the timer, please, unless you set the timer forever, that's not boneh, that's grama. That's indirect. And besides, when it comes to building, you're telling me building, he said, look at the sugya. Right, look at the sugya. If you build something that's totally disassembled, you reassemble it tight, fine, doraita. If it goes back together easily, then it's only derabanan. And if it goes together easily and loosely, then it might be mutzal lechatchila. And yet we have other sugya that say like a folding chair is mutzal lechatchila. So what's the yesod? The yesod is that's not called building at all. How does the Chazon Ish look at that sugya and say electricity is worse than any of those? It's creating something new. Shlomo Zalman looks at these sugyas and says, no, it's the opposite. Electricity, closing a circuit is the best, right? It's like a folding chair, which is less, right? A folding chair which is completely attached, right? You're not assembling or reassembling anything. You're using that which exists. You're opening and closing a faucet. You're opening and closing a door. That's called derech tashmisho. That's not boneh, that's not makav patish, that's nothing. And therefore, Shlomo Zalman writes these series of letters when he's much younger, much junior than Chazon Ish. He said to him, what are you talking about? Okay. So, the Shlomo Zalman really becomes a dominant force in electricity. The problem is that no one really knows what Shlomo Zalman said. Okay? No one knows what he said. Even though he wrote tshuva after tshuva after tshuva after tshuva on the topic, it's very hard to figure out what he said. So we'll try to look at Shlomo Zalman a little bit more. But just to sort of make it complicated. In one tshuva, he goes through the Beit Yitzchak, and he says, or the Beit Yitzchak, or whatever, and he just says, I don't like it because of this reason, all the reasons we talked about last week. But in the last line, he says, Ukvar Horez Zakein. Right, what does Kvar Horez Zakein mean? The elder has already ruled, right? Which many people take to mean that he didn't understand the Beit Yitzchak, but in terms of psak, he passed him like the Beit Yitzchak anyways. Right? That's one way of understanding Shlomo Zalman, was that he didn't really agree, he didn't understand it, but he put his authority behind it anyways because he deferred to the Beit Yitzchak. That's one way of understanding him. There's a whole other group of poskim who say, no, that's not what Rosh Shlomo Zalman meant. Rosh Shlomo Zalman was correct in taking apart the Chazon Ish and taking apart the Beit Yitzchak. The problem is that he doesn't really tell you then what his conclusion is, right? And there you have basically three positions, very quickly. One is that he basically thought it was mutter. And we just sort of have like we just treat it as usher, or it's a minhag that it's usher, or something like that. Right, those are two variations, right? That it's mutter, but we treat it as usher, or mutter that there's a minhag that it's usher. There are others, and this is what we already saw in Rabbi Rabinovich, who said maybe it's not usher at all in terms of malacha or anything like that. It's usher because of one of the various non-Shabbos-dik prohibitions, right? Of uvdin dechol, right? Which is the way Rav Henkin took it, and we saw Rabbi Rabinovich took it. But Rosh Shlomo Zalman was, on the one hand, the most dominant writer on it in many ways. On the other hand, did not make it very, very clear as to what his actual formal conclusion was, which created a lot of complexity. But let's leave it there for now. Yeah. So it's not really usher, but we treat it as usher. It's not really usher, but there's a minhag to treat it as usher, which is different. Yeah, right? Meaning that's a bit more of a formal one, right? Jackson and Ray Broyd, in their article many years ago on electricity, said that Rosh Shlomo Zalman says there's a minhag to treat it as usher. He doesn't really say that. And I'm not sure they're still convinced by it. I don't know. You have to ask them. Right, that's a little bit more of a formalization of it. We'll treat it as usher, even though we don't know why. Right, it sounds like it's less formal than that. It's more like, it's usher, I just don't know exactly why. And then there's that other position that, no, it's mutter on the halacha level, it's usher because of the more